Hi, I am Orrin, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Orrin.
Well, this has been a wonderful week, hasn't it? It seems to me that in order to understand an alcoholic, we have to understand how an alcoholic feels. I was born in Wisconsin in a small town, 6 children in the family. I'm the oldest boy. I'm the only alcoholic in the family. And I never felt comfortable with my family. I used to look at my brothers and sisters and wonder how I got there. I felt there was a mistake someplace. I never felt that my parents loved me because they didn't know how to show love. But I'm sure they did love me. They did the best they could anyway. I graduated from high school during the Depression, and it was the year that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed a bill making it legal to open bars. They were called taverns in those days. I worked at several jobs when I was in high school, clerking in stores, and anybody who had a full-time job and could make $100 a month could support a family. And they paid us 25 cents an hour in those days to clerk in a store. I never had anything to drink at home, but I was brought up in the Lutheran church, and we did have communion. And I would take one little sip of that wine, and by the time I would sit down, I could feel it. And I liked that feeling. When I was in high school and working, some of the men that I worked with would invite me then to go to the bar and have a beer. And I'd never had beer. And I thought it was wonderful because I was accepted. I grew up very tall very early, and I never fit in with the other high school students. I was too tall and too thin, and I was no good at sports. The ball never went where I threw it, and I could never catch the ball when they threw it to me, and they never wanted me to play. But I liked going to the bars, and even the first beers that I drank made me sick. And I went to the men's room and I vomited. And I went back and had some more beer. And I assumed that if you drank, you vomited. And it never occurred to me not to drink. So I used to watch to see where the other men vomited, and I never could find where they went. When I graduated from high school, I had a chance to work my way through college, and during those years I didn't drink much because there was very little money to spend. And when I graduated, I became a high school teacher when I was 22 years old. And I wasn't much older than the students, and they drank, even in those days. And I lived in the only rooming house in town that rented rooms. There were no apartments. And I ate in a hotel because it's the only place I could eat. And we complained about high cost of living in those days. I paid $3 a week for a room, and my hotel bill for food was $5 a week, and we thought that was a terrible price to have to pay. After I graduated from college and became this teacher, I was the youngest teacher on the faculty, and because I taught commercial subjects, which was bookkeeping, typewriting, shorthand, and business law, and there was a shortage of commercial teachers, I was the 5th highest paid teacher on the staff, and my salary was $1,200 a year. And out of that, I paid my mother's mortgage and worked summers, of course. And everyone in town knew me. This was before dial telephones. I couldn't even call anyone without the operator knowing who I was and who I was calling. And if I went with one of the teachers and I'd ask for Miss Johnson, and the operator would say, well, she's not home tonight. She's over at Jones playing bridge. They knew everything. There wasn't anything I could do in that town that was right. If I went out of town on weekends, the merchants would say, you make your money here and you go out of town and spend it. And if I stayed in town over the weekend, some merchant would say, what's the matter, don't you have any friends? And I was very happy to get out of that town. And I had a chance to teach in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I always liked a big city. I didn't want everybody to know me. And I taught in a big high school in Milwaukee. And again, this was the Depression years, and they didn't pay much. They paid us, we had to substitute for a full year to get permanent tenure. And usually it took several years of teaching to get 1 year. And I did have a full year in 1 year, and they paid us $5 a day. So to make a living, I worked evenings as a waiter in downtown Milwaukee. I lived on the south, I taught on the south side and lived on the east side, so that nobody who, none of the teachers knew that I was working in a restaurant, and the people where I lived didn't know I was a teacher. And I didn't have too much trouble with my drinking at that time. I remember one night I called a cab to go home, and I was crawling into the cab, and I looked up, and the cab driver was one of my fellow teachers. He never mentioned that I was drunk, and I never mentioned that he was moonlighting as a cab driver. And just when I was ready to have a permanent tenure, which is a lifetime job, Pearl Harbor Day came along. And I was 27 years old, so I knew that I'd have to go into service, and this school was in no way would give me life tenure at that age. So I volunteered for the Navy, thinking I would go to Great Lakes Naval Academy in Chicago. And typical of the armed service, they shipped all of us to Idaho. And we had big camps out there at Farragut, Idaho. They fortunately have torn them all down. And after going through boot camp, which was a disaster for me, they gave all of us who had been teachers a specialist rate called T for teacher. And we had to teach. I taught typing in the Navy in Idaho, and they immediately froze our rates so we could never transfer or have a promotion. And it was a very boring job. I had one lesson that I taught to 4 classes in the morning, and then the next lesson I taught to the same 200 men, 50 in each class, 4 times in the afternoon, and I said everything over so many times that I'd have to stop in the middle of a sentence to try to figure out what I was talking about. And I drank a lot there. It was all right for a sailor to get drunk. We used to go into Spokane, Washington, but as enlisted men, we were not allowed in a lot of the bars. Only officers could go to bars. So we would end up renting a hotel room, and 6 or 8 or 10 of us go in there with our bottles and drink. And then on Sunday, we had to go back to the camp. And most of the other men had no problem finding their barracks and finding their bunk, but I passed out very often, and I would fall in the street, and it was gravel road, and it was cold. And if I did find the barracks, I couldn't remember which bunk was mine. And somebody'd come along and say, "You're in the wrong bunk." I said, "Well, where do I belong?" And I was so glad when that war ended. And I didn't want to teach anymore because I thought I had failed as a teacher. I was so bored. And I didn't want to go back to Wisconsin and admit that I'd been in the Navy and had never seen a ship. So a friend of mine was going to his home in Oakland, California. So I came out with him, and then I went over to San Francisco. And I discovered unions. We didn't have unions in Wisconsin. And they had it very complicated. You could not get a job unless you belonged to the union, and you couldn't get in the union unless you had a job. So I decided I would be a waiter, and so I joined the waiters union because I was working as a busboy. I was carrying dishes at the Pig and Whistle on Market Street. And finally, I did get a job in a little Greek restaurant on Lower 5th Street, and it had sawdust on the floor. I went to work at midnight. By that time we were out of food, except donuts. And the only customers we had were drunken sailors and winos and girls I refer to as being in the catering business. And these girls were very smart operators. They knew the best way to pick up a sailor was to give them a drink, so they all carried a bottle of whiskey in their purse, and I let them give the drinks to the sailors if they gave me a drink. So they poured whiskey in my coffee, and they had good business, and we had good business. We sold a lot of coffee, and we had fights in there every night. If the cook wasn't drunk chasing someone with a butcher knife, the sailors were throwing chairs through the window, and we were always calling the police. And the owner would come to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he could never understand how I could go to work at midnight sober and be drunk when the shift was over. So he fired me, and this led to many jobs in San Francisco from below the slot to Nob Hill, and all of them ended with my getting fired because I drank too much. During that time, I did work in one nice restaurant, and one of the waitresses and I enjoyed each other's company. We drank together and danced, and she had a wonderful ability to be in love with whoever she was with. And one time, her boyfriend of the moment had shipped out, so I invited her over to my apartment for dinner, and 3 days later I asked her, "Don't you think you should go home?" And she said, "No, I like it here." So I said, "Well, if you're going to stay, I suppose we should get married." And she said, "Okay." And we were married. And after we were married, something happened to that wonderful friendship. And she decided that she didn't want to work anymore. And I discovered that I couldn't give her much money to buy groceries because she would buy enough food for one meal and the rest went for beer and whiskey. And so I had to work a split shift so that I could go home in the afternoon and cook for her. And then when I came home late at night, she either was passed out in bed or was out drinking someplace, and I never knew whether she'd come back that day or a few days later. And that marriage didn't last very long, and we were divorced, and then I felt I had failed as a husband. And so I kept drinking, and I soon became a falling down drunk. I don't ever remember falling down. My impression was that the sidewalk came up and hit me in the face. So I would walk along the streets with one hand out to keep the sidewalk down and the other hand up to keep the buildings from falling over. And I was always lost. I never knew where I lived. I'd walk down Post Street, which is lined with apartment buildings, and I'd take my key and I'd try every door I came to until I could find one that would open the door. And a lot of times I would then have to ring the manager at 3 or 4 in the morning and ask, "Which apartment is mine?" And he said, "Oh, go to bed, you're drunk." Well, then I discovered that my friends started inviting me to not come back to their parties because I fell down a lot and I broke things. And in those days, ladies wore hats, and one of the bedrooms was designated as the bed where they put their coats and hats, and that was always the bed that I chose to pass out on. And they took a dim view of my sleeping on their nice clothes, so they'd say, "Don't come back." Well, about this time, a couple that had been friends of mine in the service, we talked together, and they came over to see me, and they said, "Why don't you do something about your drinking?" And I said, "Oh, I'd love to. What will we do?" I thought they found a new bar, and they said, "Well, you drink too much." And I said, "Oh, no, I don't." And they said, "Well, you get drunk a lot." I said, "Well, of course, everybody gets drunk if they drink. What's wrong with that?" And they said, well, why don't you go to AA? And I asked, well, what is AA? And they said, Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had never been so insulted in my life. And I said, I am not an alcoholic. How dare you say such a thing? And he said, well, if you don't go to AA, why don't you try psychiatry? And I said, what would I do with a psychiatrist? I have a degree of my own. And they said, well, if you don't go to AA and if you won't go to a psychiatrist, you're going to end up on Skid Row. And so I figured, who needs friends like that? And I ignored them. I never called them. And while he was in college in Berkeley, and actually they came to California because I was here. I was their closest friend at that time. And he went to college at Berkeley and became a priest in the Episcopal Church. And I always drank at night. I never was a daytime person. My mother told me when I was little I didn't wake up till 9 o'clock at night. But I would get ready to go out drinking, and if it'd be 3 or 4 in the morning, I'd call people and say, let's go out and have a drink. And they'd say, well, we've been asleep for hours. Come over tomorrow. And I figured if anyone goes from San Francisco clear over to Berkeley, that's a long trip. And I should stay a few days. So I would take my 5-cent shopping bag, a paper bag, and I would pack it with socks and shoes and underwear and shirts. And then I was ready to leave. I had a canary and I couldn't leave him alone. So I'd put a towel over his cage and I'd carry the bird cage in the paper bag, and I'd go down and get the bus and get across the bay and get over to their house. And it took me all day to get to Berkeley. And when I arrived, they'd meet me at the bus depot and they'd take me home and we would eat, and then they would take me back to the bus depot. They never let me stay overnight. And I really got very mad at them for thinking I was an alcoholic. And I kept drinking. And I went to the Curran Theater, and there was a man who talked. It was called a church. And I thought it made sense. It was just, to me, psychology. He was very good, and I thought, now that's good. And I had a chance to move to Vallejo, which isn't very far away. And I went into the motel business. I didn't have any money, but there was a lady I knew who had the money, and she arranged that we would buy it in her name, and I'd do the work. And I never changed so many beds in my life. And for several years, I never had a full night's sleep because I was getting up, renting rooms to people who were anxious to have a room. And hardly anyone parked in front. They all parked out in back, and it looked like we had no business at all, even when all the rooms were full. And I discovered there was a church of that same denomination in Vallejo. And so one time I went over and I was crying, and I talked to the minister and I said, would you please help me? And it was a lady minister, and she said, well, I don't understand you alcoholics. Why don't you stop drinking? And I said, I can't. So she prayed for me, and I kept drinking. And this lady sold the motel, and I thought, well, that's good. Now I can go back to the city again. And I moved back to San Francisco, and before I looked for a job, I figured I should go on a 2-week drunk, and then I'd get a job. So I rented a hotel room, and I started drinking. And somewhere between 9 and 11 months later, I had to sober up because I ran out of money. And so I started going to class to learn about this religion that I thought would help me. And when I finished that class, I moved to Los Angeles because that's the only place that had any more classes. and I didn't drink. And I finished that class, and then I was asked to go out and speak in a church where the minister was sick. And it was in a theater, and there were no lights. And I looked at the order of service, and it said invocation. And I thought, I wonder what that is. And so I gave something, and there was no response. There were 50 people in a theater that would seat 500, and I couldn't see anything. And so it came to the Lord's Prayer. I thought, oh, well, we know that one. So I started out, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. We knew 2 lines, and they stopped, and I stopped. I said, well, let's try it again. We must know the Lord's Prayer. And I still was saying the 23rd Psalm, and none of us knew it. So I said, well, let's go to the next thing. And then it said sermon, and I never did know how to preach. So I gave them a lesson, and I was so embarrassed when it was over, because I didn't do anything right. And the board invited me to go to lunch, and they said, would you be our minister? And I said, oh, no, I couldn't possibly. I haven't finished the course yet. I don't know. I didn't know then that I was saying the 23rd Psalm. I was wondering why they didn't know the Lord's Prayer. So I finished the course, and I spoke in another church, and they asked me if I'd be their minister. And I was so surprised that anybody wanted me. And I said, well, I can be had. And so they hired me, and I went out and started a church. And I didn't know how to do it, so I just ad-libbed. And within a year, we had 100 people coming to church. And I don't remember why I left there, but I didn't like a small desert town, for one thing. And I moved to another church, and I was getting along fairly well, and then I got kind of frustrated, and so I started to drink again. I hadn't been drinking for 3 years, and I had the habit of leaving town when I drank, and I didn't tell them where I was going. And church boards are kind of narrow-minded about a minister who's too drunk to go to church. And one day I woke up in a motel, and I called headquarters, and I talked to the man in charge of the churches and the ministers, and I said, oh, I'm sick. And he asked, where are you? And I said, well, I don't know. Let me look at the hotel key. And I said, I'm in Pasadena. He said, what are you doing there? And I said, I don't know. I'm here. And he said, well, you come in here because we're having a ministers meeting, and you're being elected president of the Southern California Ministers Association. And I said, I will not come in there. I haven't shaved for days. I haven't eaten for at least 3 days. And I have the shakes. But I have to talk to somebody. So I told him the name of a hotel where I'd go. And he came over and brought another minister with him. And he was not an alcoholic. And he said, why don't you think about your church? And I said, well, what's the matter with the church? It was all right when I left it last week. And the other minister said, today get well, and we'll talk about your church later. And you know how non-alcoholics ask such dumb questions? He asked me things like, would you like a glass of milk? And I said, well, I don't know. Put one there and I'll think about it, would you like to watch television? Well, I don't know. Turn it on and I'll see if I like it. So anyway, the next day I met with them again, and they decided I should resign. So I went back to the church, and I handed the president a letter of resignation, and she handed me a letter of acceptance. It was all arranged. And I went to another church, and I started going to AA. And I had gone to a meeting in San Francisco many years before when my friends asked me not to come back to their home. And I didn't know anything about AA, and I assumed everybody drank. So I drank all day that the man was to come and get me and take me to my first meeting. And when the man looked at me, he said, we can help most people, but I'm not sure we can do anything for you. And I went to the meeting, and I didn't like anything they said. They all were dressed in gray, and they all were wrinkled, and they were all smoking, and they all talked about how they'd been arrested, and I never had, and how they'd been in institutions, and I never had, and how they'd lost their families, and I never had. I'd only been married once at that time. And then some jerk got up and said, now remember, if you come here, you can't ever take another drink. And I thought, I didn't come here to stop drinking. I came here to learn how to drink. So I stayed away for many years, and then when I had this next church, I called an AA, and I asked if I could come to a meeting. And he said, yes, we have a meeting on Friday. This was Tuesday. So on Friday I went to the meeting, and I was very much afraid that they would ask me to sign a pledge that I'd never drink. And I had sworn off 1,000 times. And I was afraid they'd introduce me as a minister. And I really was just afraid. And we had a speaker from Los Angeles, and he was telling about how he never felt adequate. He never felt good enough to have a good family and a good wife and a good job. And I could relate to that. And after a while, I started thinking, well, maybe I'm not as bad as I thought I was. You know, I've come to a meeting, and I thought that's all you had to do, to go to one. And it never occurred to me you go to meetings forever. And I was just beginning to think that I wasn't such a bad person. And he said, now remember, none of us are here because we want to be. We're here because there was no place else to go. And I thought, oh God, he didn't have to say that. So I moved away from that town, and I went down to Manhattan Beach, and I started going to meetings. And they said, go to meetings as often as you drink. And I thought, they don't have that many. So I went every night to a meeting, and I was afraid to go back to my room. And so I'd stay until everybody had left, and then I would wipe the tables and wash the ashtrays and the cups. And when 2 or 3 in the morning, when there was absolutely nothing left to do, I'd go back to my room. And you see, at night, that was my bad time. And they said, you only have to stop drinking 1 day at a time. But I couldn't do that. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I started getting desperate. And I was thinking, well, I've made it for 23 hours, but what about this next hour? So then I would say, well, I'll try it for 10 minutes. I won't take a drink for 10 minutes. And when that 10 minutes went by, I'd say, well, I'll try another 10 minutes. And finally the hour would go by, and it would be another day without drinking. And I had that wonderful feeling of relief, I've made it, and that terrible anguish of, how am I going to get through the night? And it wasn't long after I was on the program that they started asking me to speak. And I had nothing to talk about except the drunk-a-log, because I didn't have any sobriety, and my pitches were terrible. Anyway, after about 5 months with no job, I was invited by another church to be their minister, and so I went over to interview them, or they interviewed me. And before I went into the meeting, the president of the board said, Orrin, would you come outside, please? I want to talk to you. And I thought, oh God, they can't fire me. They haven't hired me yet. And he said, we understand that there were many times when you didn't make it to church. Would you like to explain that? And without thinking, I said, of course, I'm an alcoholic, and I can't help it. But I've done something about it. I now go to AA. And he said, is that all it was? Anytime you want a Sunday off, let me know. And I was so relieved that I accepted their offer, which wasn't very good. And I was their minister for 10 years. And I went to meetings. And my sponsor told me, don't go to meetings in the same city where the church is. And so I went to Manhattan Beach and had the church in Huntington Park. And I lived in Linwood. And one time one of my neighbors asked me if he could go to a meeting with me. He was having a problem, and I said, well, of course, but let's not go clear down to Manhattan Beach. Let's go to Southgate. And I thought they might know me, but for this friend's sake, he shouldn't have to go so far. And I walked in that meeting, and I knew half of the people there. They all belonged to our church. And I thought, anonymity, you know, is wonderful, but I was only kidding myself that people didn't know me. So I joined AA. Now, I tried Skid Row, and I didn't like it. And I tried suicide, and I couldn't do that right either. And I kept going to AA meetings, and I began to understand something about alcoholism. And I discovered that alcoholism is a disease. It is a disease of a twofold nature. First of all, we're allergic to it. And it's very similar to diabetes in that a diabetic cannot assimilate and eliminate sugar, and we cannot assimilate and eliminate alcohol. And I am so allergic to it that if I use aftershave lotion, which is 25% alcohol, my face breaks out in blotches. And if that was all there was to the problem, it would be simple, just don't take a drink. But it isn't that simple, because according to psychosomatic medicine, there are certain personality characteristics that are prone to certain diseases. And the characteristics that alcoholics have, there are four main characteristics. These characteristics can be changed through the AA program, and when they're changed, then we no longer desire to drink, and then we're still allergic to alcohol, but we can choose not to drink. And the first characteristic that I have, and the big book says it is a subjective feeling of unworthiness. If it was subjective only, it'd be hard to find out what it is, but most of us, I guess, have a feeling that we're not good enough to have such a wonderful wife or a wonderful job or home or children or whatever we have. And so subjectively we try to destroy it. And we even plan how we're going to do it. And we get everything ready, and then we go on another drunk. And if they just leave us alone, you know, we'd be all right. But some of them stick around and can't get rid of them. And then we have to face ourselves. And the second characteristic that can be changed is oversensitivity. And I describe this, it is like a person going into a room and seeing groups of people talking and immediately being offended because they're sure that these people are all talking about them. And if we go over close to the group and find they're not talking about us, then we're offended because they ignored us. And so no matter what they do out there, they're hurting our feelings. And the third characteristic is perfectionism. I thought a perfectionist was one who tried to be perfect, but that is not the correct definition. In the dictionary, there are only two definitions. The first one says, one who belongs to a religious cult who claims to be perfect. And the second definition says, one who can't admit they're not perfect. The hardest step we ever take is the first one. When we admit we're powerless over alcohol. Because we are then admitting that we're not perfect. And that's a lot to admit for an alcoholic. And you see, non-alcoholics have a scale for everything. At the top is 100, then 99, 98, and so on down to 0. And we don't have that kind of a scale. We've taken out all the figures between 100 and 0. And if we can't do it perfectly, then we've failed. All my life I failed. Everything I tried, I can't even wash windows perfectly. I hire a man to wash windows now, and he doesn't do it perfect either. But as long as I paid him, you know, it's good enough. He does better than I could. Just can't admit we're not perfect. And the fourth one, according to the big book, is self will run riot. Now, all of us feel that we know how to run everything. And we have wonderful ideas. We could straighten out the whole world, any one of us, in 5 minutes. The trouble is, they never ask us. And we never consider their viewpoint if it's different from ours, because obviously they're stupid if they don't agree with us. So we want everybody to ask us and to do what we say because we know and they don't. People can't even put toilet paper in the rack right, you know? Can't do anything right out there. Now, recently I was at a hotel and I was showering, and the shampoo just wouldn't bubble up at all. And I've heard it said that when all else fails, read the instructions. So I got out of the shower and put on my glasses, and I was shampooing with mouthwash. And so mouthwash is good for washing your mouth, but it doesn't do much for your hair. And it pays to read the instructions. Now, people are always coming to AA and asking, how do you do it? How do you stop drinking? And that's the answer. How? H represents honesty. We have to become honest and realize that it was our thinking that got us here in the first place. And if our thinking had been so good, we wouldn't be here. And the O, open-minded. Now, for an alcoholic, that's asking a lot, because we don't want to hear other people's ideas. But if we will honestly open our mind and listen, we'll hear something that is new. And a new thought is any thought that we never thought of before. We have to have a new way of looking at life. And the only way we can do it is by listening and opening our mind. And then W means willingness. We have to be willing to change and to try this new way of doing it. Now, it says in the big book that alcohol is cunning, baffling, and powerful. And when I had 19 years on the program, I was on a cruise to Alaska, and they have wonderful food, and I was with about 80 people I knew, and it was just great. And every night you sit at the same table and eat with the same people, and the champagne is very cheap because there's no tax at sea. So the people who can drink a lot. And every night I turn my glass upside down, and one night during the second week, I forgot to turn it over. And all of a sudden, the wine steward was pouring wine in my glass, and I stopped him. I said, "Oh, stop." He said, "Oh, that's right, you don't drink." And I looked at that little sip of champagne, and I caught myself thinking, one sip wouldn't hurt. And then I was thinking, nobody'd know. I won't tell anybody. And when I recognized what I was thinking, I thought, my God, it is cunning, baffling, and powerful. And I was so frightened of my thinking that I took that little bit of a sip and I poured it in the glass of the lady sitting next to me. She didn't even notice it. Nobody noticed it. And I was sitting there shaking. And I thought, oh, that's why I go to meetings. I have to go to meetings. You don't need me. But I need to go to remind myself that I'm allergic to alcohol. And I learn from people. When people come and tell me they've had a slip, I ask them, what step were you working on? And they usually say none. And I ask, well, what meetings were you going to? And they say, oh, I'm not going. So fortunately for me, they went out and experimented and constantly reminding me, I have to go to meetings and I have to work the steps. Now, 1984 has been a wonderful year for me. Last February, I celebrated my 25th AA birthday. And, thank you. And on February 15th, which was the day of my birthday, I was attending a convention of our churches in Los Angeles, and they presented me with a silver bowl engraved for my 30 years in the ministry, and nobody in our church had survived 25, and I was the only one who had survived for 30 years. And the administrator of that department is very familiar with AA because her father's a member, and when the meeting was over and all the applause died down, I went and I said, oh, I'm so thrilled. Look it, on this silver bowl, it has my AA birthday date. And I was more excited about that than getting the award for 30 years in the ministry. But anyway, at the end of June of this year, I finished 30 years in the ministry, so I retired. But you see, I don't believe a lot of things that people say. Some people believe that you can do anything you want and God will provide. And I don't believe that. I believe that when you pray, you have to at least shuffle your feet, you know. I know too many people who feel free to do what they want, regardless of the consequences, and that's license. That's not freedom. One of our ministers used to preach that all the time. Do whatever you want. He built a great big church. They had a $300,000 mortgage, and they finally had to fire him. 20 years ago, I decided that someday I wanted to retire. And so I started saving money and investing it. And through all these years, I've been receiving a report every month of how much I have, and I've never taken a cent out. And I've paid taxes on it, and I've tithed 10% of it from my salary to the church. And now I make more than when I worked. And I'm in the peculiar position of I can't afford to have people pay me, because if I do, it all goes to the government anyway. So I have to talk to my tax man to see if I can get around it some way. I can talk as long as they don't pay me, but I don't want to talk. So I was thrilled when Dan asked me to come here. I used to be on the circuit in Southern California, and I talked a lot, and I've come to a place now where I like to go to AA meetings, but I don't want to talk in churches. And I've had calls from all over the country, will you come and speak? And I said, no, thank you, give me a year off. I don't need it. I don't need experience. I've been doing it for 30 years. The best sermons I ever gave were the ones I gave on the way home after church. Because then I could think of what I should have said. So I find that attitudes are very important. If I go to a meeting and I expect it to be dull, then they always measure up to my expectations, and it's very dull. And if I go to a meeting with the idea, I'm going to learn something, then I will learn something, and sometimes from the most unlikely people. They'll say something that is just exactly what I need to know. A few months ago, I was invited to call on a lady in a convalescent hospital in Berkeley. And this lady had been a very brilliant woman. She wrote books and she taught English in Japan. And she was an Army librarian, and she had a very colorful, wonderful life. And then she started to become senile, and she couldn't remember anybody. And 5 minutes after you left, she couldn't remember who was there, and she didn't know where she was. So I went over to see her, And as I walked into this great big living room with beautiful furniture, there was an elderly lady sitting on a sofa with no teeth in her mouth and with a cane next to her, and she called to me, "Are you looking for me?" And I went over to her and I said, "I don't know. Are you Nell?" She says, "No." She says, "Nell who?" And I told her, she said, "No, I'm not Nell." So she motioned and I sat down. I said, "I'll be glad to talk to you anyway." And she took my hand. And she looked up at me and asked, "Who are you?" And I told her my name, and I said, "I'm Nell's minister." She said, "Oh, you're a preacher." Well, I'm really not a preacher because I don't know how to preach. I'm a good teacher, but a preacher waves their arms, you know, and they shout at the right time, and then when they want to get your attention, they whisper. And I never could figure all that stuff out. So I didn't want to explain it to her, and when she asked, "Oh, you're a preacher," and I said, "Well, you could say that." "Well, I'm a very good minister, and I attract a lot of people, and they pay me a very good salary." She said, "Oh." So in a few minutes, she looked at me again and said, "If you're a preacher, would you pray for me?" And I said, "Of course. What would you like to have me pray for?" And she said, "Will you pray that I'll become a good Christian?" And I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I said, "You already are a good Christian." She said, "How do you know that?" I said, "I can tell by looking at you. You're a very good lady, and you're a good Christian." And she said, "I am?" So in a little while I asked again, "Well, if you want me to pray for you, what do you want me to pray for?" She said, "Well, will you pray that I'll become more friendly?" And I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" And I said, "You already are friendly." She said, "As soon as I walked in this door, you spoke to me. I haven't known you 15 minutes, and we've been sitting here holding hands." I said, "How friendly do you want to be?" So again, I asked her, "What do you want me to pray for?" And she thought, and then she said, "Would you pray that I won't go to hell?" And I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I said, "There's no way you can go to hell." She said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, you're already in heaven." She said, "I am?" I said, "Didn't you know that heaven is also in Berkeley?" And she said, "No, I didn't know that." And I said, "Well, when you ran your own home, did you have a living room this big?" She said, "No." "Did you have as much nice furniture as there is here?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Did you have a staff of people that came in every day to keep things clean for you?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Do you have good food?" And she said, "Of course." I said, "Did you have a staff that came in every day and planned your meals and shopped and cooked and served you and cleaned up after?" And she said, "No." And I said, "I'll bet you have more clothes than you can carry in both hands." She said, "I do. But I'd like an address once in a while." And I said, "Well, why don't you go and buy some?" She said, "Oh." So I said, "What do you want me to pray for?" And she thought quite a while, and finally she said, "I don't know." I said, "Good. Now I'll pray for you." So I prayed and gave thanks for her consciousness, for the good that she already had, and for the fact that she was divinely guided and protected and directed, and all of her needs were given to her, and all of the good things of life were added. And when I finished, she looked up and said, "I like your attitude." Now, our attitude is very important. I don't believe that you people need me at all. Every one of you have a story, and every one of you can come up here and tell it. And that's our way of sharing our experience, strength, and hope with each other, because we need it. Now, we say this is a spiritual program, and this is a spiritual meeting today. I'm so glad I don't have to speak on Sundays anymore between 11 and 12, and look what I'm doing. Religion is man's opinion about God. And there is no area of man's thinking outside of religion where he has his ignorance so well organized. This is a spiritual program. It has nothing to do with religion. To me, spirit is feeling. And when we feel good, we say, I'm in high spirits. And when we feel funky, we say, I'm in low spirits. And all of us feel good when we're with other alcoholics. And it is that feeling good that is the spiritual side of our program. It says in our traditions, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of our organization or movement or whatever. He would remember, I don't remember words. And he said, and it said, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. We do not have a president of AA. We do not have a spokesman for AA. I attended the 25th anniversary of AA many years ago in Long Beach, California, and Bill W., the founder, was the speaker, and he said the reason AA works is because we speak from the heart. It says it's an honest program. Sometimes we tell more than we have to about ourselves, but apparently we need to for our own cleansing so that we can get it out. The people, we don't have to hear all the things you've done, but when a person has a need, they have to tell it. I think I always felt guilty. Even when I first started drinking, my first thought in the morning was, get rid of the evidence. Now, no one has to get rid of evidence unless they're guilty of something. And I used to take my empty whiskey bottle. If I was in a hotel, I would walk down the hall and put it in front of someone else's door. I didn't want the maid to know I was drinking, even though I might be passed out all day. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the University of California in Berkeley to a class of psychology students who were studying alcoholism. And when I went over there, I discovered it was a 3-hour class, and nobody told me what I was to talk about except I assumed alcohol. So I said to these students, I don't know what you expect from me. I'm not a spokesman for AA, but I will explain to you what I understand about the disease. And I went through what I've talked to you about. There's a physical allergy and a mental obsession, and how we can change the obsession. And when we don't drink, then the allergy doesn't take over because we're not giving it any alcohol to act on. And I said, now, will you people explain to me from the physical and the psychological view what alcoholism is? And they talked. I said, wait a minute, I don't understand the words you're using. Will you speak in layman's English, please? And the one who was dressed the worst turned out to be the teacher. And so I asked him, would you explain alcoholism? And he was talking in circles, and I said, I don't understand the word you're saying. Can't you speak in layman's English? Well, the different ones, the students, then started explaining something to me, and one young man said, well, I work in a hospital, and we administer drugs. And I said, well, what is the drug, and what does it do? Well, it calms them down. And I said, well, could you call it a sedative? And he said, yes. So I said, well, all right. What is your rate of recovery? He said, what do you mean? And I asked, what is your follow-up program? He said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, a year after you treat them, or 5 years, how many are sober? And he said, oh, we don't have a follow-up program. I said, then how do you know you're helping anybody except temporary? I said, in AA, we have a 75% rate of recovery. 50% of the people who come to us never take another drink. 25% go out and drink again, but they come back. And 25% do not make it. And I said, Salvation Army has a 50% rate of recovery. But you have no rate of recovery. And they didn't like what I said. And they all stopped talking. And I hadn't been there 3 hours. So I just said, well, thank you. And I left. And they never invited me back. But I think they started to think. Anyway. Now, alcoholism is a legitimate disease. The cure, oh well, in AA we say there's no cure, it's arrested. It's arrested when we lose the desire to drink. We lose the desire to drink when we change our personality. I have never seen any great change in personality until people go through the 5th step. The first year in the program was the longest year of my life. I didn't think I'd ever make it for 1 year. But I kept going to meetings. And now that I'm retired and have even more time, I go to more meetings. And none of those people need me. But I need them. Why? Because I feel comfortable with you people. I know what you're going through. I know how difficult it was for me. Times have changed since that big book was written. Someone asked me recently if I'd explain how to take the 4th step, and so I said, well, I better review that 12 and 12 again. 12 steps and 12 traditions, and I read it, and I realized in the early days, most of the people who came to AA were what we would call low-bottom drunks. And now we have a lot of ladies and young people. Some have dual addiction, and that's fine with me. Some of the old-timers resent people with dual addictions because they feel there's no physical allergy. And what difference does it make? If part of their problem is alcohol, I'm glad we have AA now, and I'm glad that young people know about it. When I was their age, I didn't know anything about Alcoholics Anonymous. The young people nowadays are more open-minded than I was. They have admitted their problem, and they're willing to do something about it. And I think it's just wonderful. We have to change too. I'm sure that if Bill W. could see what's going on all over the world in this organization, he would probably change some of the wording in there so that it doesn't always refer to the alcoholic as a man. People are people. Bill W. worked with those low-bottom drunks. And they discovered that the only way they could stay sober was to help someone else get sober and stay sober. And that's what we know too, except now we've broadened our horizon. We're a little more open-minded, I hope. And I hope that we're willing to accept anyone who wants help, regardless of their sex or age or color or background. I know that my thinking is what got me in trouble. So I try to think differently now. And that's why I go to meetings, to share what little I know about it with you and to listen to you and learn from you. And we do not claim spiritual perfection. We claim spiritual progress. I feel much better now than I used to. I'm not as afraid as much. I really feel much better than I look. Because the years have piled up. And I've never been sick in my life. I've never had surgery. I still have my tonsils and adenoids. And, when I was 65, I went to a doctor. He said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Why did you come here?" And I said, "Well, what if I ever get sick? I should know a doctor." So he checked my blood pressure, and he said, "You have the blood pressure of a young man approaching maturity." I said, "Good, write it down someplace." He said, your heartbeat is normal, your blood, urine, they check all those things. And I said, well, I smoke a lot, so check my lungs. And he did, and he said, they're clean. I said, good, write it down. Now, if I ever get sick, I'll call you. You know, he died. If I ever get sick, I'll have to start all over again. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And remember, feeling is what's important. And I know that you're happy, you feel well, and if you go to meetings, and if you work the steps, you'll feel better. And that's the spiritual part. Thank you.